I've got a lot of stuff to show you. Forgive me if I'm going too quickly. I tried to cut this down to a succinct presentation, and I just did the best I could. So, without further ado, this is what I wanted to do first was kind of give you a kind of a briefing on what brick making was like in southwestern Virginia in the earliest days of brickwork in the area, which really brickwork didn't really come to this area until after circa 1800. But this is a picture from 1855, Edward Beyer. A lot of you may know his work. And the neat thing about this photograph of illustration of Wytheville is that right in the foreground here he shows a brick making operation going on at the time. This is the brick maker, and if you can make out that pile of red bricks, that's called a clamp, and that's how the bricks were burnt in those days. A lot of people know those as called a field kiln, but what it actually is a big pile of green bricks with several arches called eyes built into the base of it, and that's where they fed the wood in, and they kept it burning for about a week. Over here you can see where he was mining the earth, which the earth around here that was used for bricks is not necessarily clay. It's a loam, which is a combination of clay, silt, and sand. So really you wanted to have a loam rather than a pure clay, and that's all they had anyways. And this is the pug mill, which they used to churn the mixture before they molded the bricks. And that was used a tethered animal, and that's why there's some livestock in this photograph. So that's a pretty good description of what a little brick making operation is like. We believe that this operation was a man named William Hufford, who identified himself in the census as a master brick mason, and he had several apprentices working under him. And he's responsible for a lot of the brick buildings that are still standing today in Wytheville. Very successful. Here's a close-up illustration of a pug mill and how it worked. The arm was tethered to livestock, which walked in a circle, and these blades on the interior kind of just churned the mixture and made sure it was a good mix. If it wasn't mixed good, the bricks just came out poorly. So mixing was a big part of the challenge of making bricks by hand. A lot of times in this area, what I find is when they were tempering the mixture, they had to temper the mixture in the pug mill by adding sand, a little bit of water, and in many cases they also added slag. You can see here the black particles. This is the Christiansburg Presbyterian Church in the lower right-hand corner. A lot of slag was used because they had big piles of slag sitting around that they didn't know what to do with. And it turned out it made great temper for bricks, and it really doesn't look bad once you step back from the building. These are bricks with what they call frogs, and the frogs are the indentions in the bottom of the brick. The ones, as you can see here, all of these frogs are different. It's 8 completely different kinds of frogs, and I've used these frogs to help me attribute which builder made the bricks and which builder built what structures, and it's actually been a very helpful technique. The ones in the upper left-hand corner are the earliest frogs in the area, and you can see they're poorly formed compared to the ones in the lower right-hand corner. Frogs, these are all from the 1820s. They're the earliest frogs that show up in bricks around here in the 1820s. These are from the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And then after the Civil War, for some reason, they become rare. But there's a lot of different benefits to having frogs in your bricks. It makes stronger walls, it makes lighter bricks, it increases internal firing and drying. It provides a key for the mortar. There's a lot of benefits to having them. And so you can see they're very individualized by brick maker. They're formed by putting a piece of wood in the bottom of the mold called a kick, which is usually fastened with a screw or a nail. And in some of these frogs you can actually see where the nail was. Well, not on these bricks, but on a lot of them you can. This is more or less how they were made. This photograph is from an 1850 treatise on brick making by a man named Dobson from London. And in England, frogs appear in bricks by 1700, so I'm not really sure why they don't show up over here until the 1820s. A real quick briefing on the bonds used, because this is kind of important to the topics and the buildings that I'm going to talk about. The bond is how the wall is held together, and the bond is accomplished by bricks that go into the wall, these header bricks, and it bonds the whole wall together. So the more header bricks you have, essentially the stronger wall you have. Flemish bond is the dominant bond in America from 1750 all the way up to about 1840 or 50. Sometimes you'll even see it later on in the 50s, Flemish bond. And it's known to be a work of, kind of a high-end brick bond. It was expensive to lay because it was time-consuming, but it's also one of the strongest bonds, and it was considered to be the prettiest bond. Back in the 1800s, people like us actually noticed this stuff, but today we're used to just seeing a brick veneer, no header showing, and it just doesn't give us any sense of curiosity about it. But after you start to look at this, you'll realize that a lot of these different bonds were used, and they can give you a lot of clues about things. Like, for instance, what side of the house were visitors formally approaching from, because that's the side where you're going to have the fanciest, most expensive bond. So if you want to know which way your driveway entered towards the old house back in the old days, a lot of times the bricks will tell you that. About 1840, this started to be old-fashioned. And a lot of times, because it was an expensive bond, the Flemish bond's only on the front of the building and the visible sides of the building. And then on the back and the less visible side, they go to what's called American bond or a common bond, which is very cheap and easy to lay and was not considered to be very pretty at all. It's just rows of headers going across. That's what bonds the wall together. Sometimes they would skip 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 intervals between each header course. This is called a header course. That's called a stretcher course, these 4 in here. About 1850, things started to get a little bit cheaper. And instead of making a alternating Flemmers and headers and stretchers on every course, they started skipping several courses. You could see this line come across and this line and down here. Each one of these is a Flemish course, but you can see they skipped 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 courses of stretchers. That's because they didn't like the look of headers by this time period. So this became the dominant bond for a little while. But it didn't take very long until they switched to an all-stretcher bond. You don't see any headers over here. And the neat thing about it is that you cannot see how the wall was bonded, but you have to assume that it was, or the whole outside layer of bricks would fall off at some point in time. Old-fashioned mortar did not glue the bricks together. It provided a cushion and a level surface. That was the reason for old mortar. It was a cushioning medium, not a gluing medium. Today, Portland cement mortars, we expect, glues everything together and it's not going to come apart. But that was not the idea when these bricks were laid. So that's just a quick course on the different bonds that you're going to see in the buildings I'm going to show you. This pretty much covers it. There are some others, but these are the main ones. The joints. How did they tool the joints between the bricks? There's about 4 different types of joints that I see around here on old brick buildings, but overwhelmingly the most popular one is called the overhand struck joint up in the right hand corner, where the mason just took a trowel and struck it overhand and beveled it inward towards the bottom brick. To us it seems a little bit counterintuitive because he's creating a ledge right here that you think might get water and bring water into the structure, but that actually didn't happen. I can't explain why, but it just doesn't cause any problems. There's lots of original mortar in these old buildings I'm going to show you, and the joints are in very good condition unless they've received a lot of weathering. The other one I see fairly often around here is a double struck joint. It's fairly rare. The beaded joint, I'm going to show you one or two examples of that, and that's about all you see around here. Okay, now I'm going to cover a lot of properties fairly quickly. You all might know a lot of these. I was in a quandary as how to proceed, whether I go geographically from county to county, or do I start at an early date and just move from county to county with the earlier structures, going towards the later structures. So that's what I decided to do. Big Spring is over on Route 11. It's kind of hidden off to on a hill above Route 11 on the south side or the east side. But it's one of the earliest brick buildings in all of the New River Valley. Our records say that it was built in 1808. One note I also wanted to make before I get started going through all these buildings is that, with the exception of a handful of brick churches, all the brick churches in this area that I know of were constructed after circa 1848. The early brick architecture of the New River Valley really consists of the homes and the outbuildings of the wealthy. Thus, a more appropriate title for my talk might be the early domestic brick architecture of the New River Valley. I didn't really think about this until I started putting this presentation together, but I couldn't find an example of a brick structure that was not a domestic structure from the first half of the 19th century. And the reason is because brickwork was just simply too expensive and time-consuming for the vast majority of the population to afford. Okay, Big Spring. It was built for David Barnett and is said to be built in 1808, and if that's true, it's one of possibly two of the earliest brick structures in the New River Valley. It was, in its original form, an outstanding example of the Adamesque or Federal style, but it was altered in 1910 by owner O.N. Mumma, transforming it into a colonial revival mansion with the addition of the Doric portico and veranda, the raking eaves, and the pedimented dormers. So exteriorly, it has changed quite a bit, and it really resembles more of a 1910 house than it does an 1808 house. But if you look closely, you see the details, like the front door, that definitely say Adamesque Federal style. Around the arch here, the round arched window, that's called gauged brickwork, because the bricks are all shaped in such a way to actually form a structural arch. And the way that they did that was they rubbed the bricks and they ground them down. Generally, they were not molded that way, but they were easily rubbed down in order to fit and become a wedge shape. So this is a pretty rare example of this type of arch in this area. You can see here too that the wall is all laid in Flemish bond. On the earliest buildings, most of them were all laid in Flemish bond, typically on all four sides of the building, and that changed a little bit later. Fotheringay, most of you know this structure, built circa 1815 for Revolutionary War veteran Colonel George Hancock, who also served as an aide-de-camp to Count Casimir Pulaski. He served in the Virginia House of Delegates and the U.S. Congress. His daughter Julia married explorer William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. The house has fine woodwork and motifs from design books by English architect William Payne. Originally, the house lacked the two bays south of the portico, that's on the right side, and so it had an unbalanced look. It was the portico and everything to the left of it, so it was kind of a tall, unbalanced looking structure. And the architecturally compatible, most people feel it's architecturally compatible addition of these two bays to the right of the portico was actually made in the 1950s. But you can't tell until you get pretty close up and you examine it. So they did a pretty neat job with that. That's definitely one of the premier brick buildings, original portico and everything in this area. I don't have a lot of interiors because we're talking about bricks, but I did work a few in. Bat Creek Farm, this may be the earliest brick structure. This is the only one that might possibly rival Big Spring. Some records say that it was built in 1790. A couple architectural historians have looked at it and decided it was probably more like 1810 or something like that. But it's located at the foot of Cloyd's Mountain. The farm was established by Colonel Joseph Cloyd, whose pioneer parents were killed by Indians in the area. The Georgian-style house was standing by 1815. It was the only brick house in Pulaski County at the time, but it may have been erected several years earlier. The house has very notable carved woodwork, again inspired by the books of William Payne, the only two houses that have that early influence. It has fashionable Flemish bond brick walls, gauged brick arches. If you don't know about the Cloyds, you're going to be hearing a lot about the Cloyds today. The Cloyds were a prosperous family, well entrenched in the area, primarily in Pulaski County, but by the late 1700s were well connected by marriage to the prominent Kent and McGavick families, with members scattered through Montgomery, Pulaski, and Wythe counties. The Cloyds were also connected to the Preston family of Smithfield. During the Revolution, Colonel Joseph Cloyd was credited for saving the life of William Preston of Smithfield, and son David Cloyd inherited this farm in 1833. A couple of the outbuildings on the property that were built a little bit later. One of the neat things about this property is just there's brick buildings all over the place. And these are a little bit later, and you can tell from these cornices, these molded brick cornices on these buildings, which we're going to talk more about. And one of the neatest things that I found on this property, I only had a few minutes to go look at this place, but it's really spectacular, is this double length brick. This is a quarter, and that's a whole brick. So you could tell that this brick is the length of two bricks, and it's an early brick on the property, early handmade brick. And the reason they made those double length bricks was to help that bonding process, so that there's actually one brick that goes all the way through the wall. But it's a real rarity. Very few people have ever seen one of these. Kentland Farm. How many of you have been to Kentland Farm? Oh, good, good. Well, we're very fond of Kentland Farm. Owned and operated, of course, by the Virginia Tech College of Agriculture. It's recognized by the state and federal governments as the Kentland Farm Historical and Archaeological District. James Randall Kent, born in 1792, took control of the existing plantation in the early 19th century and completed the manor house by 1835. Bear in mind, too, that this was lived in by faculty and students over the years, and it's kind of been run down a little bit. It's missing its portico, its original portico. It's missing its cast iron stair rail. So it's not quite what it used to be, but it could be again. It really could. It's a very fine place. It was built facing the New River on an ancient river terrace, and is one of the area's most ambitious early dwellings, with sophisticated federal detailing and uniquely carved mantels. Go to a few slides of the brickwork here. Over on the right-hand side, you see James Randall Kent's initials stamped into the bricks. I don't know why twice, but there's several bricks in the house that have this, two sets of initials in them. I went back to the house about 10 times before I finally saw them. This, again, is another gauged window arch. Well done. Looks very neat, and everything's nice and straight. The Flemish bond, in good Flemish bond, the header always lines up with a header below it and all the way up the wall. If you look at a little sloppier stretcher Flemish bond, sometimes they're a little bit off. But that was a hard thing to accomplish. Another thing is that the joints, the horizontal joints that are called bed joints, are supposed to be 1/4 of an inch thick, and the head joints, the vertical joints, are supposed to be 3/8 of an inch thick. And really the brickwork there is exceptional. This is an interesting mark in the brick. Took me a while to study on that to figure out what did it, but I've decided it was a bush that grew too close to the house and just blew back and forth until it just ate away at the bricks. On the right, you see the mouse tooth or houndstooth cornice. It's a double coursed mouth tooth cornice that wraps all the way around the house. And it takes at least 3 different types of specialized bricks. You can't see these on top, but I have another picture. A couple quick interior shots. These mantles are considered to be very significant federal style mantles. Thought you'd like to see a couple pictures of those. And this one in particular has a eagle down here on the tablet, and that is considered to be a unique, a totally unique carving that signifies the nationalist spirit of the time, the early national period. The smokehouse. The smokehouse, it's an octagonal structure. It's been in bad repair for many years. The first time I saw it, I think, was when I took that picture. It has the same cornice that goes around the house. It was built exactly at the same time as the house. Some of those JK stamps were found in the smokehouse. You can see the beveled brick that goes up on the very top of the cornice. When I found it, it was falling apart. Within a couple years, a Virginia Tech faculty member came along and decided it needed stabilized, put these rods in, and then they went and spent, I don't know, $20,000 on this shelter, which kind of obscures the whole thing. Some people say they went too far. I'm kind of happy because I feel like it's not, at least it's not going to weather anymore, and this is a very significant outbuilding. Outbuildings are significant in their own right because very few of them actually survive. And this one is just really was a magnificent little structure, especially for being a utilitarian structure. Go down there and have a look at that, and it's really pretty neat. So Kent, we know, owned by 1860 about 8,000 acres down there, and he also owned acreage in other parts of in Mercer County and so forth. And he had in 1860 123 slaves. My colleague Tom Klatka came and talked to this group, I think last year, and he talked about his excavations over there that that figured out where the slave cemetery is. So he's done a lot of great work over there. At one time, there were numerous brick structures around the house, including a large brick kitchen, which is gone now, and 13 slave dwellings. And we know about where all of these are. So if you add up the number of bricks that were made for all these structures, all these were made on the premises by slaves, and I believe under James Randall Kent's direction, and that's why his stamp is in those bricks. At least 1 million bricks were handmade on this property, and that's really the amount of work that went into that is it's unbelievable. Okay, moving on to Springfield and Pulaski County. A lot of people have drawn the similarities between this house, which half of it burnt off, and Kentland, but it's very similar in style and time period. You've got instead of an octagonal smokehouse, you've got a hexagonal smokehouse, but doesn't have all the details that Kentland's does, but it's still a neat little structure. But this is all that's left today of the house. It's over right across the river, really, from Kentland in Pulaski County. It was built for Gordon Cloyd, who at the age of 22 was appointed surveyor of Montgomery County in 1796. Gordon was the eldest son of Colonel Joseph Cloyd, who of Back Creek. We saw his property earlier. In 1797, he married Elizabeth McGavick. There's one of the early connections between the Cloyds, the Kents, and the McGavicks. Their daughter Mary married James Randall Kent of Kentland. Gordon Cloyd inherited the land where Springfield was to be constructed in 1803, but according to land tax books, the house was not completed in 1815. During the War of 1812, Gordon Cloyd commanded the 19th Brigade of the Virginia Militia, and he was eventually promoted to Major General and became known in this area as General Cloyd. The house, as I mentioned, is strikingly similar to Kentland, and it's believed that Springfield probably served as Kentland's model. It definitely predates Kentland by a decade or two. Both mansions are very refined for their time and place, and they, along with the Back Creek farmhouse and other houses, have been tenuously attributed to a Hessian builder named John Swope. If you read in Mary Kegley's histories or any of the histories of this area, Swope's name keeps coming up over and over again. He tends to be one of these Michelangelos where if we see a brick structure that looks pretty fancy, we just automatically attribute it to Swope. My research, however, indicates that Swope was not a brick mason. He did not do masonry work, but he was a finished carpenter. There is a lot of evidence that he worked for the Kents and the Cloyds. I went through James Rendell Kent's papers at Virginia Tech Special Collections, and I did find where James Rendell Kent had paid Swope, I think, a couple $1,000s, so it was for significant work. Here's what the house looked like before it burned in the 1930s. So you can see a very substantial house and very similar to the one at Kentland. And let me also mention something about the plan and the form here. The early federal structures that we're talking about now, most of them have a 5-bay facade, and most of them are what we call single pile. That is one room thick. Each room, on each floor, there's just one room on each side. All the rooms have a chimney basically, so they're all heated. And then it's also identified by a central passage that enters at the front door and goes to the back of the house. So it's a central passage plan, single pile, 5-bayed federal house. And that's what Kentland is, Back Creek Farm, Springfield, and a number of others that are still standing. Bear in mind, I'm only showing you basically houses that are still standing, and lots of them have been lost. The George Earhart house is right around the corner here in Ellett Valley. It's seen some heavy use over the years, but it's nonetheless a significant federal structure. It's a 2-story single pile central passage plan with a 1-story brick L. For some reason, this rear L is always 1 story, and that's where they do a lot of cooking. Kentland being an exception that has a 2-story rear L. But it's an example of a traditional, regionally popular dwelling plan that would persist throughout the 19th century, and there's lots of frame houses that have the same exact plan. Earhart had a 537-acre farm on the North Fork of the Roanoke River. It has molded brick cornices. Here's a good close-up of what those molded brick cornices look like. They took a couple of specialized bricks to make those, and these are very popular in the Valley of Virginia from the late 18-teens all the way through about 1850 or so. They're very popular. And it's thought that they originated because in towns, and that it was a fireproof cornice as opposed to a wooden cornice. So from 1880s to 1902, this house and grounds served as the county's poorhouse farm. So it saw some pretty heavy use during those decades as well. But that's right around the corner, and it's a good example of the form. Now here's a very good example of that form. Really, it's kind of a more perfect and well-preserved example of the house we just saw and some of the other houses, the Andrew Johnson house in Parisburg. It's probably the least altered federal-style house in the New River Valley. This outstanding home was built in 1829 for Andrew Johnson, who, along with his brother David, was a founding settler of Giles County. They were the sons of Scottish immigrants, and in 1806, the brothers contracted to lay out the town lots of Parisburg, the county seat. The house possesses all the hallmarks of the form. Single pile central passage plan with an original 1-story L. It's got the 5-bay symmetrical facade. The symmetry is very important for the federal style. A molded brick cornice, gauge brick window arches, and many other decorative features. The Giles County Historical Society received the deed to the property in 1995 and has since done some restoration work. Original stenciling on the interior was revealed and preserved during the restoration, and that's really neat. The house is open to the public, so I would encourage you to go have a tour. It's a very, very fine place. And this is very close by, right over here on Giles Road, the Keister house. Would the owner be here by any chance? All right, good for you. I really like this house a lot. It's a really neat house, and one of the neat things about this house is that it does not have that central passage plan that I was talking about. This is known as a hall parlor plan, where basically the front door walks into a room instead of a hall. You've got 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, right? And no hall. And that's a very rare form for a house that was built maybe circa 1840s or in that area, or the 30s, possibly in the 30s. But it has the cornice we've been talking about. It's got the Flemish bond brickwork all the way around. Other than the plan, it's not an unusual house, but that plan does make it an interesting and rare survival. It used to have a log section, I was reading, that was demolished long ago, that was connected by a frame L, I guess, in the back. And this is one example of a house that has a common bond on 2 sides and Flemish bond on 2 sides. So whichever side the Flemish bond is on, you know that is where most people approached from back when this was a plantation house and not sitting on Giles Road per se. Walnut Spring is a very prominent house. It's located on Tom's Creek. It belongs to an important group of Greek Revival brick houses erected by the local antebellum landed families, namely the Kents. This was the daughter of James Randall Kent of Kentland. He built this house for her and her fiance from Dr. Otey from Bedford County. It was completed in 1855 and it has an 1875 rear addition. In Kent's ledgers is an order for 130,000 bricks for Mr. Carden and Mr. Patterson. He paid James Snido and David Keister for the lime, and Noah and Henry Price for hauling the sand. A free black man named Alexander was paid for the plastering. It is an unusual example of a single-pile, gable-roofed, 3-bay Greek Revival house from the 1850s. The reason that it's unusual is because by the 1850s, we normally get a hipped roof, and a lot of the houses in the area are spreading out to a double pile plan, a 4/4, or Georgian plan as they're known. And the history says that Kent's daughter Mary originally was not too pleased with the lack of grandeur coming from the larger and fancier house at Kentland. But it's still a very fine home, and it's got great preservation, and it's a good example of what we call vernacular Greek Revival because it doesn't have a whole lot of classical elements to it. Oh, also I wanted you to look at the brickwork here. This is one of the few examples of the beaded joint that I mentioned earlier when I was showing those joint profiles. That's really very, very fine jointing. It took a good mason to do that, and it's a nicely tooled joint. You also see how straight the edges of these bricks are. These are very well made, handmade bricks. If these edges weren't nice and straight, these nice straight joints would of course be impossible. They'd have to have a thicker joint to make up for the difference in brick edges. The Honecker House, this one's a little bit out of the area, but it's right off the side of I-81. I like seeing it every time I pass by. And it's not so much related geographically, but in form to Walnut Spring because it does have that gable roof. And notice the 4 chimneys, which says it has 4 rooms on each level, so each room can be heated by a fireplace. Another very interesting thing about this house, which, by the way, has excellent preservation, is that it has stretcher bond on all 4 sides. That's very rare because stretcher bond ultimately was the most expensive bond to lay because the way that it's bonded is hidden and nobody knows how this wall is bonded. The only way to figure that out would be to take it apart. But there's a little bit of clandestine intent on the part of the bricklayer because he wants you to wonder about that. Why do I not see a header anywhere on this house? How is this wall holding together for over 150 years? The Hogue House in Giles County, I was just amazed when I cut this out of the newspaper because the house is gone. It's been gone for a while. I'm not quite sure how long, but it's very similar to a lot of other houses that are still standing. It was probably, just guessing at the date, probably built anytime from the late 1840s to the mid 1850s, and it's a good example of a Greek Revival 3-bay house. It's got the central passage. You can make out that it does have Flemish bond. This house at this time period absolutely would have to have Flemish bond, or people would not have any respect for it. The other thing that's kind of peculiar about it is the widow's walk on top. That really wasn't peculiar back then, but these days those roofs have leaked. Those flat deck-on-hip roofs started leaking from the very beginning, I think. And so over the years, a lot of people just made the roof go all the way up to a point there and got rid of the widow's walk because it was just such a hassle to keep it from leaking. But this was right on the west side of Pembroke. I don't know if anybody remembers seeing it, but I was sure disappointed to find out that it was gone, to say the least. And we don't have anything very much in Giles County to show you. I showed you the two houses that I have in Giles County. There's one other I had in, but it didn't really relate to the discussion, so I took it out. Now, Cloyd House in Dunkard's Bottom, they published this photo in the Roanoke Times a few weeks back, and it was originally from a 1932 file because when they flooded Claytor Lake, this house was taken. I don't know if they knocked it down first or if it's still down there under the water. That'd be pretty neat. But I've tried to get a hold of Army Corps records and so forth, and nobody has any documentation on exactly what happened to it or even exactly where it is that I can find. But look at the form and look at the similarity to the Hogue House I just showed you. The form is almost exactly the same. The widow's walk, and it even has this dentil cornice up here that the Hogue House had. Whether it's not the same builder, I can't really say, but we're going to get a little bit more into that. The history, it was completed, the Cloyd Mansion, between 1847 and 1849. It took a few years to build. They think it was built for David Cloyd, although his father, Thomas Cloyd, who was the son of Colonel Joseph Cloyd from Back Creek, died that year in 1849. So we really don't know a whole lot about its history. Now, this house called Springdale, I've done a lot of work on this house. I did a National Register nomination on it, and it's a very interesting house. But again, notice those similarities, and these David Cloyd and David McGavick were very closely related by marriage and by blood. This is another house that has been attributed to John Swope, the Hessian builder. Mary Kegley has that in her book. Turns out, if anyone remembers Dr. Walker of Radford, who died a couple years ago, he's owned this house since the 60s, and he brought me evidence that it was not built by Swope. It was, in fact, built by a gentleman named James C. Dyerly out of Salem. Here's a shot I took of it just a few months ago. I've come back to this house a number of times over the years because it's soon to be probably lost. It's in great danger. It's very isolated on 106 acres. It's barely been lived in the 20th century, and it needs an awful lot of work. This is an example of one of those houses that originally had a widow's walk, but because the roof leaked, it's no longer there. I've been in the attic and was able to verify that. It's also a double pile house with the 4/4 plan. And just to show you, for comparison's sake, the Cloyd house that's gone now and the McGavick house as it stands today. Virtually the same house. This one, you could tell it came a little bit later because it's got some Italianate features, namely the bracketed cornice. If you see a bracketed cornice around here, it probably was not built before, say, circa 1855. It was around 55 or 56 that those Italianate features start to make their way into the area. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of Springdale because I really love this place. It was built in about 1856, finished in maybe in 1858. And here's a document that we found in Pulaski County court records that show that James C. Dyerly is suing the patron, David McGavick, because he didn't get paid for building the house. He's suing him for $3,676, which is about probably what it took to build this house. But the interesting thing about it is the way he itemizes his work, making and laying 340,000 bricks. That's what that top line says. Hauling same from Mr. Anderson's. Mr. Anderson was the neighbor of David McGavick, but it could have been a half a mile as the crow flies because these people had so much land. Every one of those 340,000 bricks was hauled from the neighbor's property where they were made. Hauling 2 loads of planks from Cloyd's. Which Cloyd that was, we don't know. Building the smokehouse, which you see right here, contains 27,000 bricks. He got 5 cents a piece to make and lay every one of those bricks. Who would have thought 27,000 bricks in a little structure like that? But I love the proportions of that smokehouse, and it still stands. So we know a lot. They went to court several times, and both parties testified several times, and they went into a lot of detail, and I transcribed all of it, and I learned an awful lot about brick making and building from the period. A real quick tour of the inside. You've got to see this before it's gone. The plaster work in here is the best that I've seen. Again, this plaster work is something that you get with the Italianate style, but not with the Greek Revival style. So this building is right on the cusp of those two styles. It's got a little bit of both. You see that curving wall as you go up the stairs? Here's the cornice of the upstairs hall. It's in a acanthus leaf. All of this is plaster. It's all hand-done plaster. This is, there's 2 rooms on the lower floor that are decorated with this same identical plaster. The plaster medallion and the cornice all around the parlor and the dining room. And a lot of this is just ready to just drop on your head when you go in there. It's really sad to see. Vandals have gotten in there. A vandal took an axe to these beautiful oak grain pocket doors that slide in and out of the walls. All of the woodwork is faux marbled down here. That's all faux grain to look like oak. It's beautiful, it really is. There's the corner filigree. All of this plaster is based on Roman from the bath, Roman baths. And it was interpreted by the Renaissance architects, and then at this time period they started using all that stuff again. And this is an upstairs, a dining room door. You can see the marbling here, the graining on the door, operable transoms on all the doors. The ceilings are 13 feet 4 inches. Okay, moving on. Oakland Farm is just across the way from Springdale. And it's a similar house, very similar in fact. It's really one of the finest of all the surviving mid-19th century Greek Revival brick mansions in the area. It was built between 1847 and 1855 for Joseph Cloyd. This is not Colonel Joseph Cloyd, but his grandson, Joseph Cloyd. He's the son of David Cloyd, and David is the one who inherited Back Creek Farm in 1833. So the man who had this built grew up at Back Creek Farm, which is just over, just a slight distance away. All of these buildings were used as hospital sites during the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain. Some of you might know about that. There were 700 and some casualties, the only battle that we really had in this area during the Civil War. One of the neat things about this, too, is the man who built this married a woman named Mary Byers, who's a son of Colonel William Byers of Washington County. And I'm going to just in a second flash you some of the Byers stuff. But you got again the smokehouse, which still stands as a beautiful thing. And this servant's dwelling, which has a molded brick cornice, one of the latest molded brick cornices that I've come across. But it's an outstanding building in beautiful condition, stretcher bond all the way around, immaculate brickwork. This was a very expensive house. Very quickly, almost subliminally, these are buyers' houses from Washington County that I've looked at. And I didn't want to dwell on these, but I just want to draw a similarity. This man, Cloyd, married the daughter of the man who built these 3 houses in Washington County. So there's a strong tradition of brickwork that's totally dependent on their massive wealth throughout southwestern Virginia. Weldon, again in Pulaski County. It's another house belonging to this important group of Greek Revival brick houses. The house stands on land known as the Robinson Tract, which is just west of the town of Pulaski. And this land was owned by James Randall Kent of Kentland at the time the house was built for his daughter Cynthia. So he built the house at Walnut Springs near Price's Fork for his other daughter. He actually had 6 daughters that were said to be beautiful. Probably these are the 2 most beautiful because they both married doctors. And they both got fancy houses. I don't know. 5 daughters, excuse me. So she married Dr. Henry Moss Bentley of Dublin in 1837. Kent gave her 1,000 acres called Weldon, and Kent himself is said to have supervised the construction, which began in 1839 and finally completed in 1852. This house has some very refined brickwork. You couldn't see in that photo, but you can here. One of the really neat things about this house is these panels around each window. You can see how they go back into the wall about a brick. That's the only house I know of that has that around here. It's got a fancy Italianate-derived cornice. It's got a coarse gauge jack arch here. You can see that that's broken up into several courses of bricks vertically. So that was a difficult thing to build. And then this is called a water table, where it protrudes down here. The wall comes out about a half a brick. And then up here, this is called a belt course. It wraps all the way around the house. That's a very unusual feature for this time period and this place. The woodwork is very fine. I've not been in the house, but I've seen some pictures. But I did take these pictures myself. This house is just really amazing. Maybe you've seen it. It's back behind the Heathwood area, back behind the Fox Ridge Apartments. And you have to go, it's private, so I don't really recommend you go up to it, but it's one of the most just incredible houses around here. And one of the things I like about it, it combines the 3-bay facade from the Greek Revival period with the 5-bay Federal facade, and yet introduces some Italianate features such as this window hood and so forth. The folks who know Smithfield are probably familiar with this house because it was built for James Francis Preston, who was, I believe, the grandson of William Preston and the brother of Robert Preston, who built Solitude next to the duck pond on the Virginia Tech campus. This house, I believe, was also built by James C. Dyerly, the same man from Salem who built Springdale. And one of the reasons is because of the bonds used on this house, and that I've found out that the Dyerlys were very well acquainted with James and Robert Preston. His brother David Dyerly built a church that Robert Preston signed the deed for, and so I'm attributing this structure to the Dyerly family out of Salem. The brick walls are laid in expensive stretcher bond and the Flemish variant bond, and it using outstanding bricks made on the premises. It has 2 entrance facades. That's another thing that the Dyerly builder seemed to use a lot. This is an entrance facade, and that's an entrance. The primary entrance facade is secondary on that side. So that's about it. Note also the interior chimneys. This is the only house in this entire talk that has chimneys in the middle of the building, and that's a later thing that you get usually after the Civil War, because people stopped heating their houses with wood. just a typical wood-burning fireplace, started using coal, and stoves were commercially available. They're advertised in all the newspapers. And when that happened, it coincided with builders now moving the chimneys to the center of the house. So those chimneys are on each side of the central hall now, heating the rooms on both sides. So that's a significant difference that makes this a little bit of a later house. I've got just a couple more to show you. The Hogue Farm in Pulaski County is another very interesting property. You can see here how it started off as on the right as a single pile federal house in the 1820s. This man did mining on the property, actually was mining coal on the property and made a fortune off of it. And then along about 1875, he came and added this Italianate addition to the front. The brickwork is really very nice, and it's just an excellent property. This is said to be an old mining commissary on the property, but it dates to around the same time as that original house, and it's good to see the old smokehouse still standing. Everybody knows this place, but I couldn't leave it out because it's just too prominent. It's just too neat. It's just a fantastic place. It looks a lot better now if you've passed it on I-81 recently. A fellow from Bluefield bought it. He's done a lot of beautiful work to it, a lot of nice painting. Unfortunately, all this parging or stucco, the correct term is parging, on these brick columns deteriorated. So he cleaned it all off, and he hasn't found anybody who's capable of reparging it. Unfortunately, it's a very tough job, and there's not that many people that really know how to do it with lime mortar. So if you drive by there now, you will see two columns of brick, and they're made out of pie-shaped, handmade bricks, these columns. The house was built about 1840 for two Cloyd brothers, Stephen McGavick and Joseph Cloyd McGavick. So I'm so confused with Cloyds, McGavicks, and Kents at this point. Who knows? But their grandfather was James McGavick, who was the patriarch of all the McGavicks in the area. This was built right overlooking the fort at Fort Chiswell, which was a fort that helped guide people down the Great Wilderness Road and protect them from the Indians. And of course, that fort's long gone now because I-81's going right through the middle of it. In 1839, these brothers contracted with two guys, Lorraine Thorne and James Johnson, to build this brick house. It's unusual in many respects, with what would be best described as classical revival decorative features, such as the original two-column portico, the paired semi-exterior end chimneys with the stepped parapet, and between on each end of the building, you can't see in this photo, the Palladian window. That's a classical motif, and that's really very rare around here for this early period. This porch came later. It's an East Lake style porch. It came in the late Victorian era. Beautiful stone foundation. This top floor is a ballroom. It's a big, gigantic ballroom with a, I don't know, 16-foot ceiling. It's really incredible. And it was unoccupied for a long period of time when I took these pictures. But connected to the building here, you got the kitchen in the middle, and then the smokehouse on the very end. The smokehouse having all kinds of problems because the bricks are just leaching out salt and they're deteriorating quickly. But the guy who's got it now seems to be taking care of it. One of the neatest things about this place are the bricks. They're a lot smoother. I don't know if you could tell from the previous shots I've shown you how much smoother these bricks are. There's basically no laminations. They don't have a sandy texture. And that's because these are the only bricks I've found in southwestern Virginia that are called oil stock bricks. Instead of using sand to help the brick release from the mold, they used oil, linseed oil. And this was a technique that was basically brought to Virginia by Thomas Jefferson when he started building the University of Virginia in about 1819. He experimented with oil stock brick. He was the first in Virginia to do that, and he wrote about that. Interestingly enough, a man named Thorne worked for Jefferson at UVA. It may not have been Lorraine Thorne who built this structure, but it was somebody named Thorne. And so I think it's it's very curious that we've got oil stock bricks and a brick mason named Thorne who's working on this place. But very good joinery and beautiful bricks here. You can't leave this one out. The Major Graham house, a house described as unforgettably eccentric. It chronicles the changing taste of a wealthy family during the 19th century. David Graham was the founder of Graham's Forge, and he built the first brick section, which is right in front. Let me get to a better slide. Of course, this house has to be haunted. There's no way that this house cannot be haunted. He built this first section right here in 1855, and you can tell it looks a lot like imagine it without that roof, because that roof came later. Everything else, though, is just like these other buildings I've been showing you. He built that onto an 1840 frame section, which is still in the back. You can't see it. But then Major David Pierce Graham, his son, inherited the house and the forge industry in 1870 and continued adding on the house using differentiated materials and new stylistic references through the late Victorian period. So now we have a second Empire-style mansard roof, and we've got a late Victorian addition on the side with this very peculiar orange-colored shiny brick, which is really neat brick. And then again, I have to show pictures of outbuildings because there's just so few of them standing. But this was some form of offices or quarters where the slaves worked and so forth. This has a different kind of cornice that I didn't really show you any close-ups of. That's called a corbelled brick cornice, and it's just layers just jutting out and jutting out. But that's not it's also a common form of cornice in this area. Rockwood Hall. I think I got one more after this to show you. Rockwood Hall, we recently added to the National Register. This is also in the Cloyd Kent McGavick family. The daughter of James Randall Kent at Kentland married basically a rancher, a cattleman named Samuel Bell, who James Kent brought down from, I think it was Maryland or somewhere up north, to buy cattle for him. Sam Bell was so successful that he became the biggest cattleman in southwestern Virginia and just became enormously wealthy. And he did all kinds of things like shipping cattle overseas. He was one of the first to do that. Very interesting place, and this building is just decked out completely inside and out. It was finished in 1875, and it's got features from just a lot of eclectic features with classical stylistic references. The neat thing about this, though, is it was built by an architect and builder from Lynchburg, a very well-known architect named Burkhalter, and a very prominent builder named Pettyjohn. And they built stuff all over Lynchburg. You can't read about Lynchburg architecture without reading about these guys. But this man was wealthy enough to hire them and get them to come down here and build. Which leads me to the John Robinson house, which is right outside of Graham's Forge, right next to Graham's Forge. This is a highly unusual house because it has a Y-shaped plan. It has porches on 3 sides of the house, windows on maybe 10 sides. It has so many different elevations that you get cross breezes. You've got a shady porch to sit on no matter what time of day or what time of year it is. You go to a different porch. It's got Italianate features, outstanding brickwork, outstanding stonework, the foundations, the steps, everything. Well, it turns out that this man, the architect Burkhalter from Lynchburg, built the same exact house for himself in Lynchburg, a Y-shaped house. Therefore, I've extrapolated that to attribute this house in Wythe County to not only Burkhalter but the builder Pettyjohn. If you look at the interior finishes, they compare very closely with the house in Lynchburg and also Rockwood Hall, which I just showed you. So that was a pretty neat revelation. I think that's it. Yep. Okay.